The subject of Lecture 4 is corporate level strategy, which addresses the basic question of where an organization should compete. Which industries or which parts of the value chain, for example. And there are two readings that address this question, shown on slide 2. The HBS note on corporate strategy, and the brief reading on the 9-box matrix. For the 9-box matrix reading, you'll see a link to a podcast. It's about 15 minutes long, and I recommend it for some additional background and insight into the matrix. The HBS note defines corporate strategy as a set of choices to create value through configuration and coordination of multi-market activities. And this definition speaks to the difference between corporate level strategy and business level strategy. Corporate level involves choices about multi-market activities, but business level involves choices about competing in a single market. There are two key choices to make in corporate strategy, one involving scope and one involving ownership. Corporate scope choices involve deciding whether corporations should maintain a presence in a certain market, and ownership choices involve deciding whether a corporation should actually own a business outright or maintain a presence through a joint venture, an alliance, or some other mechanism. And there are two tests that strategists conduct to try to guide corporate strategy choices: the Better Off test and the ownership test. The Better Off test applies to corporate scope, and it asks whether the presence of the corporation in a given market improves the competitive advantage of other business units over and above what they could achieve on their own. If you can answer yes to that question, the corporation should maintain a presence in that market. The ownership test applies to ownership choices, as the name suggests, and it asks whether ownership of a business unit produces a greater competitive advantage than an alternative arrangement might produce. And it's only when both the Better Off test and ownership test are satisfied that a strategist would then conclude that owning a business unit that serves another market is the right choice. If the answer to the Better Off test is yes, but the answer to the ownership test is no, we would conclude the corporation should maintain a presence in the market, but through some other mechanism besides ownership. We can think about applying these tests with horizontal diversification choices. Horizontal diversification is the simultaneous ownership of two or more units that utilize a similar set of resources. In the example from the HBS note, the cardboard and tissue units illustrate horizontal diversification. Both use output from the paper unit as a critical resource. With horizontal diversification, the Better Off test can be satisfied by economies of scope. This is when the total cost of producing two goods jointly is less than the combined cost of producing each separately. So a facility that manufactures both cars and trucks might have lower production costs through shared resources compared to the cost of producing each separately. The Better Off test could also be satisfied by cross-selling benefits. Cross-selling is especially relevant when customers prefer one-stop shopping. And the ownership test might be satisfied if there are major obstacles for two businesses to write a contract. So, for example, sharing intangibles like specialized knowledge between businesses can be very difficult to work out through a contract. And if writing a contract is not feasible, then ownership might be the right choice. We can also apply the Better Off and ownership tests in the context of vertical integration. Vertical integration is the simultaneous ownership of two or more units where the outputs of some units become inputs for other units. Lumber and paper businesses would be vertically integrated because paper uses the output of lumber. A number of conditions might satisfy the Better Off test for vertical integration. When there are relationship-specific investments, for example. When business units need to make investments to modify their assets for exchanges with each other. Without joint ownership, there might be a fear that one business unit takes advantage of the other after a substantial relationship-specific investment has been made. when there's downstream free riding, when a firm free rides on the efforts of a competitor, if you have two retailers, one charges high prices but gives customers helpful information and service, the other charges low prices and gives customers no information, customers might seek information from the first retailer but then buy from the second. And if this free riding hurts a supplier's overall demand, that supplier might want to vertically integrate into retail. And when there's double marginalization, when two firms in a vertical relationship each price at a markup over marginal cost, this increases prices and reduces output. If the two firms vertically integrate, the supplier then transfers its products at marginal cost, and this lowers prices and increases output. As with horizontal diversification, the ownership test for vertical integration might be satisfied if there are major obstacles to writing a contract. A final point to make on corporate strategy is to carefully think through the costs of ownership. Compare any potential benefits to those costs. Incentive costs are one type of ownership cost. If a supplier now has a guaranteed customer after being acquired, that supplier might have less of an incentive to be the most efficient producer. Capital misallocation costs involve the corporate office's decision to allocate capital among different business units. Business units might be allocated too much or too little capital. And power costs. With power differences among business units, managers might engage in power games that undermine trust through the entire corporation. Moving on to the second reading on the 9-box matrix. The HBS reading noted capital misallocation costs, and the 9-box matrix is essentially a framework to help mitigate those costs. It's meant to help prioritize investments among different business units. And there are two key variables: industry attractiveness and the unit's competitive strength within the industry. Slide 10 illustrates the matrix. A strategist would place each unit within the matrix and make capital allocation decisions based on that placement. For units above the diagonal, a corporation would invest in and grow those business units. For units along the diagonal, there'd be selective investment. And for units below the diagonal, the corporation may sell or liquidate those units or run them just for cash without making additional significant investments. Slide 11 is meant as a reference for conducting an assessment of industry attractiveness for the 9-box matrix. That assessment might look at a number of different factors, including market size, expected growth rate, industry profitability. And slide 12 is a reference for assessing competitive strength of the business unit. Relative market share and relative profitability are two potential factors to include in a competitive strength assessment. So, summing up Unit 4, corporate strategy addresses the question of where an organization should compete. In which industry should it compete? In which parts of the value chain should it be involved? And as a strategist, you should be guided by two tests in your corporate strategy choices: the better off test and the ownership test. A risk of ownership is capital misallocation, and the 9-box matrix is a practical framework to help reduce that risk and to prioritize investments among different business units.